I don't know why I went back. I told myself it was to clear my head, to get away for a weekend, but deep down, I think I wanted to prove something to myself, that I wasn't afraid of that place. The cabin had belonged to my uncle before he died. A simple structure deep in the woods, built for hunting trips and solitude. It was a couple of hours from town, far enough that cell service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away. I had only been there once before, years ago, and I remembered how still it was. Too still. No distant hum of passing cars. No voices from nearby houses. Just the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under some unseen weight. I didn't like it then. I don't know why I thought it would be any different now. The drive was uneventful. The last stretch was a dirt road full of potholes, the kind that rattled your teeth and made you grip the wheel tighter. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky, the shadows stretching long between the trees. The place looked exactly as I remembered, wooden, worn, almost blending into the forest around it. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The air felt heavy, but I told myself it was just the weight of the silence. Inside, the air was stale. Dust clung to the wooden walls, and the scent of old wood and something faintly rotten lingered. I lit a few of the kerosene lamps, their weak glow pushing back the darkness just enough to make the place feel less empty. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a few mismatched pieces of furniture, and a cot in the back room. It wasn't much, but it would do for the weekend. I spent the first few hours settling in. I checked the windows, the doors, made sure nothing had gotten in since my uncle had last been here. The woods had a way of reclaiming things left alone too long. I stacked firewood near the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and made myself a quick meal from the canned food I'd brought. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the trees in a way that almost sounded like voices whispering. I ignored it. The first night was uneasy. I woke up multiple times, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs, too heavy for a raccoon, too rhythmic for the wind. I held my breath and listened. Nothing, just my own pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was my imagination, but I stayed awake longer than I wanted, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. It never came. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. They weren't mine. They weren't boot prints either. Barefoot, human. The toes dug deep into the earth, like whoever left them had been pressing down hard, almost clawing at the ground as they moved. They led from the edge of the trees to the cabin and then disappeared back into the woods. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe a lost hiker? A prank? The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away, but something about the prints bothered me. They were too deep, too erratic, as if whoever made them had been moving strangely, shuffling, stumbling. I swallowed my unease and told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let a few footprints send me packing. The second night was worse. I locked the cabin up tight before bed, made sure the windows were latched. The wind had died down, leaving everything eerily still. I lay there for a long time, listening, waiting. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the leaves outside. This time, there was no mistaking it. I sat up, heart hammering. The steps circled the cabin, stopping near the front door. Then, a soft scraping sound, fingernails against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, but I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound stopped. I waited, body rigid, every muscle tensed. Minutes passed, then an hour. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was just before dawn. The first light was creeping through the trees, and everything was quiet again. I forced myself to check outside. More footprints. This time, they went around the cabin in circles, dozens of them overlapping, twisting in strange, erratic patterns. My stomach turned as I followed them to the front door. The wood was scratched, long claw marks dragging down to the ground. I left that morning. I packed up my things, locked the door behind me, and didn't look back as I drove away. I told myself I had imagined it, that the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But as I reached the end of the dirt road, something made me slow down. A figure stood at the tree line, not moving, not waving, just watching. I didn't stop. I didn't try to get a better look. I pressed down on the gas and didn't let up until I was back on the main road, the cabin miles behind me. I never went back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of footprints in the dirt, circling my bed in the same erratic patterns. And when I wake up, I swear I can still hear the soft, slow scrape of fingernails against wood. The cabin in the woods. I don't know why I agreed to stay out there alone. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. I don't know. But I do know this, I'll never do it again. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, Jeremy. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden structure his grandfather built decades ago, sitting deep in the woods of northern Michigan. No plumbing, no electricity, just a propane stove and an old wood-burning fireplace. Jeremy always talked about how peaceful it was, how he'd go out there to clear his head. I needed that. Life had been a mess lately, and a few days of solitude sounded like exactly what I needed. It was mid-October when I drove up. The trees were mostly bare, the air crisp with that damp smell of decaying leaves. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, potholes filled with rainwater from the night before. My truck struggled over some of the deeper ruts, but eventually the cabin came into view. It was just as I expected, small, weathered, with a sagging porch and a single window on the front. A shed stood off to the side, leaning slightly, as if years of snow had pushed it to its limits. I stepped out of my truck, stretching after the long drive. It was dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just me and the woods. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single bed against the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with old canned goods, and a fireplace stuffed with crumpled newspaper. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. I set my bag down on the bed and got to work. The first thing I did was get the fireplace going. Nights would be cold, and I didn't want to wake up freezing. The wood stacked beside the fireplace was dry, which made starting a fire easy. Soon, the room flickered with a warm glow, and I sat down, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. I spent the first few hours settling in. I checked the shed outside, finding a rusty axe and some extra firewood. The outhouse, a few yards behind the cabin, was as awful as expected. Just a hole in the ground with a wooden bench over it. But it was functional. Everything was fine. Then the first night came. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching, like footsteps in the fallen leaves. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows against the walls. I listened. Nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself back under the covers. But I couldn't shake the feeling, that deep, nagging feeling that someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching. The sound never came back, but sleep didn't either. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt. But there was nothing. The air was still, the forest empty. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The second day was uneventful. I hiked a little, chopped some firewood, read an old book I found on the shelf. It was actually nice. The stillness, the solitude. I started to think maybe Jeremy was right. Maybe this place was good for clearing your head. Then the second night came. I was more prepared this time. I made sure the fire was stacked high, throwing as much light as possible. I even dragged one of the chairs in front of the door, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, closer this time. I sat up, heart hammering. The firelight flickered against the window, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. Then 3 loud bangs against the cabin wall. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the axe from beside the fireplace. My hands were sweating, my breathing too loud. I stood there, waiting, The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I moved toward the window. Slowly, carefully, my reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. I forced myself to look beyond it, into the darkness outside. Nothing. I barely slept that night, jerking awake at every little sound. The fire burned down again, but I was too afraid to get up and add more wood. I just lay there, clutching the axe, waiting for morning. By the third day, I was done. Whatever peace I'd come for was gone. I packed my things, doused the fire, and locked the cabin up tight. I didn't even bother checking the shed or outhouse. I just wanted to leave. The dirt road was worse after 2 nights of rain. My truck's tires skidded in the mud, the back end fishtailing. I gripped the wheel, cursing, forcing it straight. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Just trees. But my gut told me I wasn't alone. That feeling, someone watching, it clung to me, thick as the fog that had rolled in overnight. I was halfway down the road when I saw them. Footprints. Deep, fresh footprints in the mud. Human. They led from the trees, straight toward the cabin. Toward me. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I just kept driving, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I made it back to town in record time, pulling into Jeremy's driveway like a bat out of hell. I told him everything. The footsteps, the banging, the footprints leading out of the woods. He just stared at me, his face pale. Then, he said something that made my stomach drop. I never go out there alone. Never. That was the last time I ever stepped foot near that cabin. I didn't think anything of it at first. It was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing special. I had rented it for a few days, hoping for some quiet time away from work, noise, and people. I wasn't looking for adventure or anything like that, just some space to clear my head. The listing was simple. Remote location, no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Sounded perfect. I packed a bag with the essentials, threw in some food, and drove out there alone. The drive took longer than I expected. The road turned from pavement to gravel and then to dirt, winding through dense trees that grew taller and thicker the farther I went. My phone lost service about 20 miles from the cabin. That should have bothered me more than it did, but I told myself I'd be fine. People lived without phones before, right? The cabin was small, nothing fancy, just a single-story structure with a front porch, a tin roof, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a single window on the front, dusty and streaked from rain. The door was heavy wood, old but sturdy. I had to force the key into the lock and jiggle it a few times before it turned. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped in. There was a couch pushed up against the far wall, a small wooden table in the center of the room, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. The kitchen was just a counter with an old gas stove and a sink. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress, and there was a tiny bathroom with a toilet and a shower that looked like it barely worked. Everything was old but functional. I dropped my bag on the bed, stretched my arms, and took a deep breath. It was quiet. Not just normal quiet, but deep, unnatural quiet. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no planes overhead, just the wind outside, rustling through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt off, like the silence was too heavy, pressing in on me. Shaking it off, I unpacked my things, set up the small radio I had brought, and turned it on. Static. No stations came through. I turned the dial slowly, but there was nothing, just dead air. I left it on anyway. The static was better than silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace to warm the place up, ate a sandwich, and read a book until I got tired. I slept fine, no weird dreams, no strange noises. When I woke up, the fire was out and the cabin was cold. I got up, made some coffee on the gas stove, and stepped outside. The woods stretched out in all directions, thick and dark. The air was crisp, and the ground was damp from the morning dew. My car sat where I left it, parked on a patch of dirt beside the cabin. Everything was still, too still. I walked around the cabin, checking things out. There was a small shed out back, locked with an old rusted padlock. I hadn't noticed it the night before. I tried the door, but it didn't budge. I didn't care enough to force it open. Probably just old tools or junk inside. I spent most of the day hiking, trying to enjoy the fresh air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense, a pressure at the back of my mind, like I was being watched. Every time I stopped walking, I listened, expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, just my own breathing, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional bird call. I turned back earlier than I planned. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat at the table, staring out the window. The trees stood like shadows against the fading light. I felt uneasy, like something was just beyond the tree line, standing there, watching. I locked the door before going to bed. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My heart pounded. I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I waited, barely breathing. Then a single, sharp knock at the front door. I didn't move. My mind raced. No one knew I was here. No one should be here. Another knock, harder this time. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. I tiptoed to the front room, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door was locked. I stared at it, waiting, listening. Then the doorknob turned. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I held my breath. The knob rattled again, harder this time, like someone was testing the lock. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Then silence. Whoever was out there was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Morning came, and I went outside, half expecting to find footprints. There were none. The dirt around the cabin was undisturbed. But I knew what I had heard. Someone had been there, watching, testing the door. I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for 3 nights. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag in the car, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. The road felt longer on the way out, like the trees had grown closer together overnight. I didn't relax until I saw the main highway in the distance. My phone got service again, and I checked the time. I had only been there for a day and a half, but it felt longer. When I got home, I did some digging. The property had been abandoned for years before it was listed as a rental. No one had lived there permanently since the 1970s. The previous owner had vanished without a trace. Just gone. No explanation, no sign of struggle. His car was still parked outside when they found the cabin empty. I don't know who or what was outside my door that night. Maybe it was a drifter. Maybe it was something else. All I know is I'll never go back. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the need to get away from the noise of my life. Maybe it was the way the listing had described it. Isolated, peaceful, deep in the woods. Or maybe I was just too tired to care. Whatever the reason, I packed my bags, threw them in the trunk of my car, and drove 3 hours into the middle of nowhere. The drive was long. After about an hour, I left the last real town behind. Gas stations and fast food places became fewer and farther between. Eventually, all that was left were long stretches of road lined with thick trees. No houses, no signs of life. When I finally turned onto the gravel driveway, I could feel the crunch of loose rock beneath my tires. The path twisted through dense forest, and for a moment, I had the unsettling thought that if my car broke down out here, no one would find me for days. The cabin itself was small but sturdy looking. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, a wraparound porch with an old rocking chair. The kind of place that felt like it had been there forever. The listing said it had belonged to an old hunter who had built it decades ago. Now, it was a rental for people looking to disconnect. No internet, no phone signal, just me and the woods. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was simple, a worn-out couch, a scratched-up wooden table, a single bed with a stiff mattress. A fireplace sat in the corner, stacked with logs. The only decorations were a few hunting trophies mounted on the walls. A deer head stared at me from above the fireplace, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light. I set my bag down and checked the kitchen. There was running water, at least. No fridge, just an old icebox. The bathroom had a shower and a toilet, but the water pressure was weak, and the pipes groaned when I turned the faucet. Basic, but it would do. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on the old gas stove, read a book by candlelight, and went to bed early. It was strange being surrounded by so much silence. Back home, there was always some kind of noise, cars, voices, the hum of electronics. Out here, the quiet was almost too much. Every small sound, the creak of the cabin settling, the wind against the trees, felt amplified. But I told myself I'd get used to it. The second night, things started to feel different. I had spent most of the day hiking, exploring the woods. By the time I got back, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. The air had a bite to it, the kind of cold that settled in your bones. I made a fire, warmed up some canned food, and sat on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods were big, empty. There was no one out here but me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It sat in the back of my mind, a quiet, nagging presence. I looked out at the trees, searching for movement, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside. It was faint, barely noticeable over the sound of the wind. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. Probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A deer. But then there was a sound that didn't fit. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Human footsteps. My heart started to pound. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, clicked it on, and shined it toward the window. The light reflected off the glass, showing only my own pale face staring back. I didn't see anything outside. No movement, no shapes, just darkness and trees. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was alone out here, but I locked the door anyway. The next morning, I found footprints. They were in the dirt just outside the cabin. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been walking around while I slept. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. They led from the tree line to the porch and then back again. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't tried the door, just stood there, watching. I thought about leaving right then, packing my things, getting in the car, and driving back to civilization. But I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I didn't want to admit how scared I was. Instead, I told myself it was a hunter, someone passing through. Nothing to worry about. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees. But it wasn't the wind that made my stomach twist into knots. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held the flashlight tight in my hands, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. Then silence. I didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed. Finally, I heard it. The sound of retreating footsteps, disappearing into the woods. Morning came and I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. My hands were shaking as I popped the hood, staring down at the engine like I had any idea what I was looking for. The battery was there. The cables were intact. But the car was dead. I was stuck. Panic settled in. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away. I had food, water, supplies, but the thought of spending another night out here made my skin crawl. I spent the day trying to fix the car, but nothing worked. I checked the wires, the fuel, everything I could think of. Still dead. As the sun started to set, I made a decision. I was going to walk. I packed a bag with the essentials, a flashlight, water, a knife. I locked the cabin behind me and started down the gravel road, my heart hammering in my chest. The walk felt endless. The woods stretched on forever, the trees pressing in from all sides. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my nerves jump. But I kept going. Then I saw it, a figure, standing in the trees, just off the path. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't move. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't work. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached. But I didn't stop until I saw the first signs of civilization. A gas station, a flickering neon sign. I burst through the doors, gasping for breath, barely able to speak. The man behind the counter stared at me like I was crazy. I didn't care. I made him call the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. They drove me back to the cabin, but by the time we got there was nothing to find. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. The car started on the first try. They didn't believe me. I left that night. I never went back. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone, I still get that feeling, the sensation of being watched. And I wonder if somewhere out there he's still watching. I don't know why I agreed to stay there alone. Maybe I wanted the quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. But I should have known better. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut when I first saw the place. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It belonged to my uncle, who had bought it years ago as a hunting retreat. He barely used it anymore and offered it to me for a weekend getaway. I had been dealing with too much stress, work, life, everything. I needed time away. The drive took nearly 2 hours, the last 30 minutes spent on a narrow dirt road full of potholes. Tall trees loomed on either side, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. It was late October, and the air had that sharp chill, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter around yourself. I had no cell service out here. I knew that going in, but it didn't bother me much. A few days of solitude sounded perfect. The cabin itself was old, built decades ago. A single-story structure with faded wood, a sagging porch, and a roof that looked like it needed repairs. The windows were small, and the front door was thick, solid oak with a rusted handle. There was no lock, just a simple latch. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. The furniture was sparse: an old couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, a single bed in the corner with a thin mattress. A wood-burning stove sat against the far wall, its metal body blackened from years of use. A few cabinets held canned food, and a small sink was connected to a well system that my uncle said still worked fine. There was no electricity, no running water except for the hand pump, no distractions. I set my bag down and started a fire in the stove. The sun was already setting, and I wanted to get settled before it got too dark. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. No cars, no people, just me. That first night, I slept lightly. Every creak of the cabin woke me up. The wind outside picked up, rattling the thin window panes. At some point, I thought I heard something moving outside, slow footsteps crunching through the leaves. I held my breath and listened, but the sound faded. Probably just an animal. The next morning, I stepped outside to a heavy mist hanging between the trees. The air was thick, damp. I walked around the cabin, checking things out. That's when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Not mine, not an animal's. Human footprints circling the cabin. The dirt was damp from the night's mist, and the prints were fresh. I felt my stomach twist. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through. Maybe someone got lost and wandered near. But why would they walk all the way around the cabin? And why didn't they knock? I tried to shake it off, told myself I was overthinking it. The day passed slowly. I read a book, chopped some wood, made a simple meal on the old propane stove. I tried to enjoy the silence, but the unease stuck with me. As the sun dipped below the trees, I found myself dreading the night. I locked the door, not that it would do much. I kept the hatchet near my bed. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, faint but distinct, a slow, deliberate creak from the porch. I held my breath. The fire in the stove had burned low, leaving only a faint orange glow in the room. My heart pounded in my chest. The creak came again. A step. Someone was out there. I wanted to move, to get up, but I was frozen. I strained my ears, listening. Then, a soft tap on the window. Not a knock. Tap. Light, deliberate. I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the flashlight beside me. My fingers fumbled with the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the window. Nothing, just the glass, reflecting the dim light of the fire. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the hatchet so tightly my fingers ached. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. My breath fogged in the cold morning air. I looked around. More footprints, closer this time, leading from the woods to the porch. I was done. I packed my bag, shoved everything back into my truck, and got the hell out of there. The drive back felt longer, every shadow in the trees making my skin crawl. When I finally reached town, I pulled over at a gas station. I needed coffee. I needed to feel normal again. As I stood by the pump, waiting for the tank to fill, an old man sitting on a bench nearby nodded at me. "Been out in the woods?" he asked. I nodded. "Which cabin?" I hesitated, then told him. His face darkened. He let out a slow breath and shook his head. "People don't stay there long," he said. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know. I got in my truck and drove home. I haven't been back since. The road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through thick woods. My truck's tires crunched over the gravel as I drove deeper into the trees, the occasional pothole jolting me in my seat. It had been raining earlier in the day, and the ground was still damp. The headlights cut through the early evening gloom, illuminating the trees that stood tall on either side of me, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. I wasn't here for fun. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had passed away a few months back. It had been sitting empty since, and my family was debating whether to sell it or keep it as a getaway spot. I had volunteered to come up for the weekend, check the place out, and make sure everything was still in good shape. It wasn't a long drive from home, maybe 3 hours, but the last stretch felt endless. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. When I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, I cut the engine and let the silence settle around me. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a quiet house. It was thicker, heavier. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the faint rustle of leaves and the chirp of insects. The cabin itself was an old, one-story structure, built solid but showing its age. The wooden porch sagged a little, and the front door had peeling paint. I grabbed my bag from the truck, stepped onto the porch, and unlocked the door. The smell of dust and stale air hit me as I stepped inside. It was just one big room with a small bathroom in the back. There was a kitchenette to the right, a wood-burning stove in the center, and a cot against the far wall. Everything was just as my uncle had left it. I set my bag down and went through the place, checking for leaks or any signs of animals getting in. The power wasn't on, but the place had gas lanterns and a small generator. I figured I'd get to that later. For now, I just wanted to get a fire going since the air inside was damp and cold. As I was stacking wood into the stove, I noticed something odd. The latch on one of the windows was broken. It wasn't a clean break, either. It looked like it had been forced. The wood around it was splintered. My first thought was animals, maybe a raccoon or something trying to get in. But the break was too deliberate, too precise. I felt my stomach tighten a little. Maybe some teenagers had been messing around, or maybe some hunter had tried to use the place for shelter. I told myself I'd fix it in the morning and pushed the thought away. Once the fire was going, I set up a lantern and ate a quick meal. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Something about the cabin felt off. Not haunted, not supernatural, just wrong. I locked the door and windows, double-checked everything, then lay down on the cot. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees outside, and for a while it was peaceful. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling sound outside, like someone stepping through the leaves. I held my breath and listened. The wind had died down, and the sound was still there, slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy for that. I sat up and reached for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on, pointing it toward the window, but all I saw was my own reflection in the glass. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just my nerves, but I kept the flashlight close. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a different sound, wood creaking. My first thought was the stove, but the fire had burned low, and the sound was coming from outside. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking, like weight shifting on the porch. My pulse pounded in my ears. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound, and reached for the hunting knife I had brought with me. I strained to listen. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving anymore, just standing, waiting. I forced myself to get up, moving as quietly as possible. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it at the front door. Through the small window, I could see the porch, but it was empty. The creaking had stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as I was about to move away from the window, I saw it, the faintest movement in the tree line, a shadow shifting just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was out there. I turned off the flashlight. I didn't want to give away my position. I moved back to the cot, knife still in hand, and sat in the darkness, heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing happened. The fire dimmed to embers. I kept my grip on the knife, listening, watching. Eventually, exhaustion won. My head dipped forward, and I must have slept because when I woke up, the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. The fire had gone cold. My back ached from sleeping upright. I got up stiffly and moved to the window. The forest looked the same as it had the night before. Calm, empty. But then I stepped onto the porch, and my stomach dropped. There were footprints, fresh ones, leading up to the door but not away from it. Whoever had been out there had stood just inches from where I had been sleeping, listening, watching. And then they had simply vanished into the trees before sunrise. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, tossed it into the truck, and left without looking back. I didn't care about checking anything else in the cabin. My family could send someone else. I never told them what happened. They ended up selling the cabin a few months later. I don't know who bought it. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I think back to that night, I wonder how long they stood there, listening, waiting, and what would have happened if I had opened that door. I don't know why I agreed to come out here alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I was just tired of being around people. The cabin was my uncle's, sitting deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town. He used it for hunting trips, though he hadn't been up here in years. When I told him I needed to get away for a while, he offered me the keys without a second thought. The drive up was long. The deeper I got into the forest, the more I realized how alone I was. The trees swallowed the road, their branches reaching over like bony fingers. My phone lost service about an hour before I arrived, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The cabin was small, nothing fancy. A single-story structure with a porch that sagged under its own weight. The wood was weathered, the windows smudged with years of dirt and pollen. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. There was a fireplace in the corner, a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years, and a small kitchen with a propane stove. No electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an old generator that my uncle warned me barely worked. I unpacked quickly, not liking the way the shadows stretched across the walls as the sun dipped lower. The quiet was unsettling. I hadn't realized how much I relied on background noise until there wasn't any. No cars, no people, no distant hum of city life. Just the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the creaking of the old cabin settling. That first night, I barely slept. The bed was uncomfortable, but it wasn't just that. It was the feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that I wasn't used to this level of isolation. But every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something moving outside. Branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. I kept my knife close, even though I knew it was probably just an animal. The next morning, I went to check the well. It was about 30 feet deep, lined with old bricks that were cracked and covered in moss. The water looked clean enough, but as I was pulling the bucket up, I noticed something odd. The rope was frayed, like someone had been yanking on it. I brushed it off, probably just wear and tear. I filled a pot and brought it inside to boil just in case. The day passed slowly. I tried reading, but I kept getting distracted by every little sound outside. Around noon, I took a walk around the cabin just to familiarize myself with the area. The forest was thick, the ground covered in dead leaves and underbrush. About 50 yards behind the cabin, I found something strange. An old, rusted-out truck, half buried in the dirt. The windows were shattered, the inside gutted. It had been there for a long time. I peered inside. Nothing but a few scraps of fabric and what looked like old bones. Probably animal bones. At least that's what I told myself. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the unease had settled deep in my chest. It felt like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I tried to shake the feeling, cooking a simple meal on the propane stove and forcing myself to eat. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal. Animals are erratic, quick. This was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I stayed in bed, listening, my heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. Maybe it was a trick of my mind. Maybe I was imagining it. But then I heard it, the sound of the doorknob turning. I shot out of bed, my pulse roaring in my ears. I hadn't locked the door. Why the hell hadn't I locked the door? I grabbed the nearest chair and wedged it under the knob just as it started to creak open. The pressure stopped. Silence. For what felt like hours, I stood there, waiting, barely breathing. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous. I was leaving, but when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, human footprints. They led from the tree line to my door, circling the cabin just like I'd heard. But there was something worse. They never led away. I don't know why I agreed to come out here alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I was just tired of being around people. The cabin was my uncle's, sitting deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town. He used it for hunting trips, though he hadn't been up here in years. When I told him I needed to get away for a while, he offered me the keys without a second thought. The drive up was long. The deeper I got into the forest, the more I realized how alone I was. The trees swallowed the road, their branches reaching over like bony fingers. My phone lost service about an hour before I arrived, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The cabin was small, nothing fancy. A single-story structure with a porch that sagged under its own weight. The wood was weathered, the windows smudged with years of dirt and pollen. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. There was a fireplace in the corner, a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years, and a small kitchen with a propane stove. No electricity, no running water, just a well out back and an old generator that my uncle warned me barely worked. I unpacked quickly, not liking the way the shadows stretched across the walls as the sun dipped lower. The quiet was unsettling. I hadn't realized how much I relied on background noise until there wasn't any. No cars, no people, no distant hum of city life. just the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the creaking of the old cabin settling. That first night, I barely slept. The bed was uncomfortable, but it wasn't just that. It was the feeling of being watched. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that I wasn't used to this level of isolation. But every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something moving outside. Branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. I kept my knife close, even though I knew it was probably just an animal. The next morning, I went to check the well. It was about 30 feet deep, lined with old bricks that were cracked and covered in moss. The water looked clean enough, but as I was pulling the bucket up, I noticed something odd. The rope was frayed, like someone had been yanking on it. I brushed it off, probably just wear and tear. I filled a pot and brought it inside to boil just in case. The day passed slowly. I tried reading, but I kept getting distracted by every little sound outside. Around noon, I took a walk around the cabin just to familiarize myself with the area. The forest was thick, the ground covered in dead leaves and underbrush. About 50 yards behind the cabin, I found something strange. An old, rusted-out truck, half buried in the dirt. The windows were shattered, the inside gutted. It had been there for a long time. I peered inside. Nothing but a few scraps of fabric and what looked like old bones. Probably animal bones. At least that's what I told myself. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the unease had settled deep in my chest. It felt like I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. I tried to shake the feeling, cooking a simple meal on the propane stove and forcing myself to eat. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal. Animals are erratic, quick. This was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I stayed in bed, listening, my heart pounding. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. Maybe it was a trick of my mind. Maybe I was imagining it. But then I heard it, the sound of the doorknob turning. I shot out of bed, my pulse roaring in my ears. I hadn't locked the door. Why the hell hadn't I locked the door? I grabbed the nearest chair and wedged it under the knob just as it started to creak open. The pressure stopped. Silence. For what felt like hours, I stood there, waiting, barely breathing. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous. I was leaving, but when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, human footprints. They led from the tree line to my door, circling the cabin just like I'd heard. But there was something worse. They never led away. I pulled off the main road onto a narrow gravel path, the tires of my truck crunching over loose stones. The GPS said there was another mile or so to go, but the road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Trees on either side pressed in close, their bare branches clawing at the sky. It was late October, and the air had that sharp, biting cold that hinted at an early winter. I had rented the cabin for a week. The idea was to get away from everything, no work, no stress, just quiet. I had been feeling burned out, and my friend Eric had suggested this place. He had stayed here a year ago and swore it was the most peaceful experience he'd ever had. No phone service, no Wi-Fi, just you and nature, he'd said. That sounded perfect to me. The trees thinned as I got closer, revealing the cabin up ahead. It was small, built from dark logs with a steep roof and a wide front porch. A firewood stack leaned against one side, and a single rocking chair sat in the corner of the porch. The whole place looked abandoned, which made sense. It was the off-season, and I had been told no one else was renting any of the nearby properties. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked up the steps. The key was right where the owner had said it would be, in a rusted metal box beneath the porch railing. It was stiff in the lock, but after a few tries, the door creaked open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn-out couch, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A small kitchenette was tucked into the corner, and a single door led to what I assumed was the bedroom. The place was cold, so the first thing I did was get a fire going. The wood in the stack outside was dry, and within minutes, flames crackled in the hearth, sending flickering shadows across the walls. I unpacked, made a quick dinner, and settled onto the couch with a book. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. It was the kind of night where the world felt distant, like nothing existed beyond the trees surrounding the cabin. I had expected to feel relaxed, but something about the silence put me on edge. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just the wind. I brushed the thought aside and went to bed. The mattress was stiff, and the blankets smelled musty, but I was exhausted. I drifted off quickly, but sometime in the night, I woke up to a noise. A single, deliberate knock. I sat up, heart pounding. It had come from the front door. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind. I stayed still, waiting, but there was no second knock. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. I forced myself to lie back down, but it took a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and scanned the area. The gravel road ended just past the cabin, turning into a barely visible trail leading deeper into the woods. The firewood stack looked untouched, and there were no footprints on the ground except my own from last night. I told myself I had imagined it. I spent the day hiking, following a narrow deer path down to a small creek. The water was ice cold, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I sat on a fallen log for a while, enjoying the quiet. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky into shades of orange and pink. That night, I woke again. Not to a knock. This time, it was something else. Footsteps. Slow, measured steps on the porch. I barely breathed. My mind scrambled for explanations. A bear? A deer? No, the steps were too precise, too human. They stopped just outside the door. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was outside could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. First down the porch steps, then fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I checked the porch again. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe it was just an animal. I decided to stay. That night, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and kept the fire burning low. I lay in bed, listening. At some point, I drifted off. Then something woke me. Not a sound. A feeling. I wasn't alone. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. I didn't move, barely even breathed. My eyes adjusted, scanning the room. Then I saw it. A shape standing just inside the bedroom doorway. Not moving, just standing there. I didn't scream. Couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my brain refusing to accept what I was seeing. It was a man, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. I could barely make out his face in the dim light. Then he moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. My breath hitched. I acted on pure instinct, threw myself out of bed, grabbed the heavy lamp from the nightstand, and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with something solid, and there was a grunt of pain. I didn't stop to see what happened next. I ran out of the bedroom, through the front door, barefoot into the freezing night. I sprinted to my truck, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it just as something slammed against the back of the truck. I didn't look. I started the engine and floored it, gravel spraying behind me as I tore down the narrow road. The trees blurred past, and my mind was screaming at me to get away, to keep going, to not stop until I saw another person. I drove for miles, not slowing down until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and just sat there, hands clenched around the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I called the cabin's owner the next morning, told him someone had broken in. He sounded confused, said no one had stayed there in months, said the area was deserted this time of year. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. To this day, I don't know who he was, or how long he had been watching me before I ever noticed. I didn't expect to feel so uneasy when I arrived at the cabin. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip. Time away from work, away from people, just me and the quiet. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. A full week alone in the woods, with nothing but my thoughts, my books, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The drive up had been normal, uneventful even. The last stretch was a long dirt road cutting through dense forest, the kind of place where the trees feel like they're closing in around you. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. An old structure, maybe from the 60s or 70s, with a steeply pitched roof and a wraparound porch. It wasn't the kind of cabin you'd find in a luxury vacation rental. It had history, maybe even a few secrets, but nothing that set off alarm bells. I unloaded my things and settled in quickly. The inside was basic. A fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom with an old wooden bed frame, and a single bathroom. There were no modern luxuries. No TV, no internet, no cell service. That was the point, though. I wanted the quiet. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it outside, walking the trails around the cabin, listening to the distant sound of a stream somewhere deeper in the woods. The sun went down earlier than I expected, casting deep shadows across the trees. I built a fire, made a simple dinner, and read by the flickering glow until my eyes got heavy. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the cabin's siding. But as I sat up, fully awake now, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was slow, deliberate, not an animal, too heavy. I told myself it had to be my imagination, but then I heard the creak of the porch boards shifting under weight. Someone was out there. I moved carefully out of bed, avoiding the spots on the floor that creaked. The windows were covered with thin curtains, so I couldn't see out, but that also meant that whatever was out there couldn't see in. I stepped over to the front door and checked the lock. It was solid. The deadbolt was in place. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding in my ears. I waited, expecting to hear something else. A knock, maybe the sound of retreating footsteps, but there was nothing, just silence. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before finally forcing myself to move back to bed. I barely slept. Morning came slowly. The first thing I did when the sun was up was check outside. There was nothing unusual. No footprints on the porch, no sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the old wood shifting in the cold night air. That's what I told myself. The second night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I sat in the dark, waiting. I heard the footsteps approach, slow and steady, stopping just outside the door. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something standing right there. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, and then, just like the night before, silence. No retreating steps, no sign of movement, but I knew whatever it was, they were still out there. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping a knife I had pulled from the kitchen. I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I had 5 more nights left, and I was already starting to unravel. The third night, I barricaded the door. I dragged the heavy wooden table against it, stacked a chair on top. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. I sat by the window, watching, waiting. The footsteps came later this time, well past midnight. Slow, careful. The porch groaned under the weight of something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, something different. A long, steady scrape against the door. Not knocking, scraping, like something dull being dragged across the wood. My skin crawled. I wanted to move, to do something, but I stayed still. The scraping continued, slow, methodical. Then, after what felt like an hour, it stopped. Morning felt like a relief, but it was short-lived. When I stepped outside, I saw it. The door was scratched. Long, deep marks running down the wood, like someone had dragged a knife or a blade against it. My stomach turned. I should have left then, but I didn't. The fourth night, I barely turned off the lights. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting. The night stretched on, silent. No footsteps, no scraping. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crackle from the dying fire. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, not scratching. Breathing, close, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just sat there, heart hammering, gripping the knife so tightly my fingers went numb. The breathing was slow, controlled. Not an animal. Not some random wanderer lost in the woods. Someone was out there, standing just inches from where I sat, separated only by a thin pane of glass. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep. I barely even blinked. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed fast, threw everything into my bag, not caring if I left anything behind. I went outside, scanning the trees, the empty porch, the long dirt road stretching away into the forest. Everything looked normal. I got in my car, started the engine, and backed out fast. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, where I finally felt like I could breathe again. I don't know who was out there, what they wanted, why they never tried to force their way in. Maybe they were waiting. Maybe they were just playing with me. I don't go to cabins anymore. I don't go anywhere that quiet. And I never sleep without a locked door. I never liked being alone in the woods, not because I was scared of animals or the dark, but because something about being isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, always made me uneasy. It was the kind of unease you couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, just a deep, gut-level discomfort that never fully went away. But I needed the time alone. That was what I told myself when I packed up my truck and headed north toward a cabin that belonged to a guy from work. He was one of those people who was always talking about getting away from the noise of everyday life, retreating to the woods where he could think. I didn't see the appeal, but when I mentioned offhandedly that I needed some space for a while, he insisted that I borrow his place for a few days. I took him up on it because I had nowhere else to go. My breakup had left me in a strange place, like I was drifting through life without any real direction. I needed a reset. I needed quiet. The cabin was a little over 2 hours away, tucked deep in a dense stretch of forest near a lake. The drive there was peaceful at first, but as the sun started to dip below the trees, a familiar unease settled over me. The road narrowed as I got closer, the trees pressing in on either side like walls. There was no cell service out here, no radio stations either, just the hum of my tires on the road and the occasional crack of a branch in the woods beyond my headlights. I reached the cabin just as it was getting dark. It was smaller than I expected. A simple one-room structure with a tiny porch and a stack of firewood beside the door. No electricity, no running water. Just a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and an old lantern hanging on a hook by the door. The guy from work had given me basic directions on how to use everything, and I wasn't worried. I had brought enough supplies to last a few days, and I figured I'd spend most of the time reading or hiking. I carried my bags inside, lit the lantern, and set about making the place livable. The inside was rustic but clean. A cot against one wall, a small table and chair, and a shelf full of old books and canned goods. The windows had thick wooden shutters, which I left open for now. I liked being able to see outside. That first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, read by lantern light for a while, and turned in early. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself I was imagining the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to sleep. The second day, I went for a long hike, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. It was beautiful out there. Tall pines stretching high into the sky, the forest floor soft with moss and fallen needles. The air smelled fresh, crisp. I felt good, better than I had in weeks. Then I found the trap. It was a steel snare, rusted but still functional, half buried in the dirt. The kind used to catch small game. I didn't think much of it at first. People hunted out here after all. But as I kept walking, I found another one, then another, each one set carefully along the path, spaced just far enough apart that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. That was when I started feeling uneasy again. I turned back toward the cabin, moving faster than I had on the way out. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt wrong. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. That night, I locked the cabin door and closed the shutters. I told myself it was just to keep out animals. Still, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made me tense up. Listening. Nothing happened. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I packed my things, ready to leave early, but when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The firewood beside the door, it had been stacked differently. I was sure of it. The night before, the logs had been piled neatly, all in the same direction. Now they were slightly off, as if someone had moved them and put them back carelessly. I stood there for a long time, staring at the woodpile, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it could have been an animal, a bear maybe, but deep down I knew better. I threw my bags into the truck and got in, ready to go, but the second I turned the key, I knew I was in trouble. The engine wouldn't start, just a clicking sound. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hoping it was something simple, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what I was looking at, and that was when I saw it. The wires had been cut. Clean, deliberate. Someone had done this on purpose. I felt a wave of cold panic wash over me. I was stranded. No cell service. No way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away. I went back inside the cabin, locked the door, and grabbed the old hunting knife I had brought with me. I sat on the cot, listening, waiting. Hours passed. The sun started to set. The lantern flickered. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling it. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms sweating. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move. Then, suddenly, something heavy slammed against the door. Once, twice, then nothing. I sat there in the dark, knife in hand, heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Whoever was out there, they were testing me, seeing if I would come out. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. By morning, the forest was quiet again. I forced myself to step outside, knife still in my grip. There were footprints in the dirt, human footprints, leading from the trees to my cabin, circling it, then disappearing back into the woods. I didn't think. I just ran, down the road as fast as I could. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran until I reached the highway, where a passing truck driver picked me up and took me to town. I told the police. They went out there, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of anyone else. Just my truck still sitting there with the wires cut. They told me it was probably just a vagrant, maybe a prank, but I knew better. Someone had been out there watching me, waiting for me to come outside. And if I had, I don't like to think about what would have happened. I never went back to that cabin. I never spoke to the guy from work about it either. I just left it behind, tried to move on. But sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I think about those footsteps, about the heavy thud against the door, and I wonder if they ever found someone else. I rented the cabin online. It was a last-minute thing. I needed a break, some time alone. The pictures looked decent, old but sturdy, tucked deep in the woods. The description said it was a quiet place, no cell service, perfect for unwinding. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was longer than expected. I followed the directions the owner had sent me, turning off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that wound through dense trees. My tires crunched on loose gravel as I went deeper. The trees got taller, shadows stretching across the road as the sun sank lower in the sky. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. It looked smaller in person, a squat structure made of old logs. The windows were dark, the porch sagging a little at one end. It had that abandoned look, like no one had been there in a while. My gut tightened, but I brushed it off. I was just tired. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint smell of damp wood and dust. I flicked the light switch. A single bulb in the ceiling flickered before glowing dimly. The cabin was basic: a tiny kitchen, a living area with a worn-out couch, and a bedroom in the back. The bathroom was even smaller, just a toilet, sink, and a rust-stained shower. No TV, no radio, no Wi-Fi. I set my bag down and went to check the back door. It had an old latch, rusty but solid. The windows were locked. Everything seemed fine. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just the isolation. I wasn't used to being this cut off from everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mattress was thin, and the cabin groaned in the wind. Every creak sounded too sharp, too deliberate. I told myself it was just an old building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept thinking I heard something outside, just beyond the trees. A rustling, maybe. Footsteps? Every time I sat up to listen, the sound stopped. Morning came slow. The sunlight barely touched the inside of the cabin. I made coffee with the cheap instant stuff I had packed, sipping it on the porch. The woods were still. No birds, no wind, just silence pressing down all around me. That uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. I spent the day exploring, trying to shake the paranoia. I found a small stream about a half-mile from the cabin, the water murky and slow-moving. I followed it for a while before heading back. The trees felt closer now, pressing in from all sides. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone standing there. But it was just trees, just shadows. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, closer, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Not the wind, something moving. I lay in bed, heart pounding. The cabin had no curtains. I didn't want to look at the windows, didn't want to see what might be out there. Then something thumped against the wall. A dull, heavy sound. I stopped breathing. The thump came again, lower this time, near the door. I sat up slowly. My hands were shaking. I reached for the flashlight I had packed, but my fingers were clumsy in the dark. The beam cut through the room, bouncing off the walls. Another sound, a scraping like something being dragged across wood, right outside the front door. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. My body screamed for me to do something. Run, hide, anything, but I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. I didn't sleep. I stayed in bed until the sun started pushing weak light through the windows. Then, I finally forced myself up and went to the door. The porch was empty. No footprints, no signs of anything. Just the quiet, just the trees. But I knew what I heard. I wanted to leave. I should have packed up and driven off right then. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. That evening, I built a fire in the old stone pit outside. The flames felt like a barrier, keeping the shadows at bay. For the first time since I arrived, I almost felt safe. Then I saw it. Something at the edge of the trees. A shape, not an animal, tall, thin, just standing there, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to keep my eyes on it, but it didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the trees. My hands gripped the arms of the old wooden chair I was sitting in. My legs felt numb, like they wouldn't work if I tried to run. Then, slowly, the shape stepped back into the darkness. Gone. I stood up so fast the chair tipped over. My mind raced. Was it a person? A hunter? Someone messing with me? I didn't stay to find out. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and got into my car. My hands fumbled with the ignition, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The engine roared to life. Headlights cut through the trees as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving. Not until I hit the highway, not until I saw streetlights and other cars. Not until I knew I was back in the real world, away from whatever was in those woods. I never reported it. What would I say? that I heard noises, that I saw a shape. I checked the rental listing a few days later. The cabin was gone. The listing removed, like it was never there. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who was out there, but I know I'll never go back. I always thought of myself as a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural stuff. But I do believe in fear, the kind that grips you deep in your gut when you realize something isn't right. The kind that makes your body move before your brain even catches up. I felt that fear once, in a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town or help. It started with a trip I never should have taken. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and feeling like I was running on fumes. My friend, Mark, told me I needed to take a break, get away from the city, clear my head. He had a cousin with a cabin out in the woods. Said I could stay there as long as I wanted. No cell service, no internet, just me and nature. It sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. The further I got from civilization, the more uneasy I felt. Maybe it was the long, empty roads or the way the trees seemed to swallow the light. I shook it off. I was just tired. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was setting. It was smaller than I imagined. Just a single-story building with a wraparound porch and a woodpile stacked against one side. The forest pressed close on all sides. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wood-burning stove, a sagging couch, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with an old, creaky bed. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a stash of candles. I found a note on the table from Mark's cousin, saying there was a well outside for water and an outhouse a short walk away. It ended with, "Be careful at night. Things get wild out here." I laughed it off. He probably meant animals, maybe coyotes or bears. I made a mental note to be cautious and locked up for the night. The first night was fine. I slept harder than I had in months. The silence was almost unnatural. No sirens, no honking cars, just the distant sound of the wind through the trees. When I woke up, I felt better than I had in a long time. I spent the day exploring the area, chopping some wood, and reading by the fire. That night, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Something moving just beyond the trees. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't small either. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The forest was still, too still. I shined the light around but saw nothing. No animals, no movement. Just the trees standing there, quiet and watching. After a while, I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The next morning, I found footprints near the well. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the well and then back into the woods. They weren't animal tracks, too big, too deliberate. I crouched down, trying to make sense of them. They looked human, but something was off. The stride was strange, like whoever made them had been dragging one foot slightly. I told myself it was a hunter or a hiker who got lost. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Who hikes this deep into the woods barefoot? I spent the day on edge, checking the windows, listening for sounds. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept the hatchet close. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some noise outside. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. Could have been the wind, but I didn't believe that. Then, just before dawn, something scraped against the cabin wall. Not an animal, not the wind. It was deliberate, slow, testing. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so hard my hands ached. The sound moved from one wall to the next, circling the cabin. My stomach clenched. I wanted to turn on the flashlight, but I was afraid whoever or whatever was out there would see it as an invitation. Eventually, the noise stopped. The sun rose. The feeling of relief that washed over me was brief, because when I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw it. The footprints were back. Only this time, they didn't stop at the well. They led right up to the porch, right up to the door. I packed my things in minutes. I didn't care if it was some lunatic messing with me or something worse. I wasn't staying to find out. I threw everything into the truck and peeled out of there, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station hours away. When I finally got cell service, I called Mark and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Yeah, my cousin doesn't have a cabin. I don't know whose cabin I was in. I don't know who or what was outside that night, and I don't ever want to find out." I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle being alone. I enjoyed silence, I enjoyed the woods, and I had no fear of the dark. But that was before the weekend at the cabin. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. I had been feeling drained. Work was endless, my phone was always buzzing, and I hadn't had a real moment to myself in months. The idea of spending 3 days completely off the grid in a cabin deep in the woods sounded perfect. No service, no people, just me and nature. I found a place through a rental site, a small cabin about 10 miles from the nearest town. It was old but well kept, and the owner assured me it had everything I would need: wood for the fireplace, a small kitchen, and enough supplies to last my trip. The moment I saw the pictures, I was sold. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, the last stretch nothing but a narrow dirt road winding through dense trees. It was beautiful in the daylight, golden sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin itself was small and rustic, tucked between towering pines. There was a fire pit out front, a small porch with a rocking chair, and a single window facing the woods. I stepped inside, setting my bag down by the door. The air smelled like old wood and dust, but it felt comfortable. There was a bed against the far wall, a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove, and a fireplace with a neat stack of logs beside it. Simple, but enough. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I had expected the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, maybe the distant hoot of an owl, but there was nothing. Just silence so deep it felt unnatural. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to it. Living in the city, there was always noise, even in the dead of night. Here, in the middle of nowhere, sound didn't carry the same way. I built a fire in the fireplace and made myself dinner, then sat outside for a while, staring up at the sky. The stars were bright, clearer than I had ever seen them. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly alone. Not in a bad way, felt peaceful. It wasn't until I went back inside that I noticed something strange. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I came back from my car earlier. I always locked doors. It was a habit, but maybe I had forgotten this time. I shook it off, locking it and double-checking before heading to bed. I woke up around 3 a.m. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the room. The air felt different, heavier. I turned over, pulling the blanket up to my chin, but then I heard it. A soft creak came from the front porch. I held my breath, listening. Another creak, like weight shifting on old wood. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the quick, light steps of an animal. It was slow, deliberate, human. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door. The only light came from the dying fire, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I listened for a long time, but there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and forced myself to lie back down. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, looking at the porch. The wood was damp from the morning dew, but there, right near the steps, was a footprint. A boot print, larger than mine. I stared at it for a long time. There was no way I had made that print. I hadn't stepped there. I felt my stomach twist, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was old. Maybe it had been there before I arrived. That had to be it. Still, I spent the day trying to shake the uneasy feeling. I walked through the woods, following a narrow trail that led to a small creek. The air was cool, the sound of running water calming. I sat on a rock for a while, watching the water rush over smooth stones, trying to clear my head. It almost worked. Almost. That night, I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and kept the fire going longer than before. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then, creak. I froze. It was louder this time. Closer. Creak. It wasn't coming from the porch. It was inside. My body went rigid. I could hear my heartbeat, fast and heavy in my ears. The sound had come from the far side of the room, near the kitchen. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I strained my ears, waiting. Then a soft shuffle, like fabric brushing against wood. I didn't move, couldn't. The air was thick, pressing down on me. I didn't hear breathing, didn't hear anything else. Just the silence, stretching out for what felt like an eternity. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the dark corner of the room, waiting for something to move. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. The fire was dead. I sat up slowly, my muscles stiff. My eyes darted to the corner of the room. Nothing. But when I stood up and stepped into the kitchen, I saw it. The chair at the small wooden table had been pulled out. Just slightly. I hadn't touched it. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. I didn't think. I didn't try to explain it. I just grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and walked straight to my car. The air outside felt lighter, almost normal, but I didn't care. I turned the key, hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I backed out so fast my tires kicked up gravel. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, still and quiet, the door slightly ajar. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I made it back to town in record time, booked a hotel for the night, and locked every single door. The next morning, I sent the owner a message, telling them I had to leave early. I didn't explain. I didn't want to know. A week later, I saw the news. A man had been arrested not far from that area, caught breaking into another remote cabin. He had been living in the woods for months, moving from empty cabin to empty cabin, taking what he needed, watching from the trees. I try not to think about it, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder, if I had stayed one more night, would I have woken up to the sound of my door unlocking? I always thought of myself as a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural stuff. But I do believe in fear, the kind that grips you deep in your gut when you realize something isn't right. The kind that makes your body move before your brain even catches up. I felt that fear once, in a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town or help. It started with a trip I never should have taken. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and feeling like I was running on fumes. My friend, Mark, told me I needed to take a break, get away from the city, clear my head. He had a cousin with a cabin out in the woods. Said I could stay there as long as I wanted. No cell service, no internet, just me and nature. Sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. The further I got from civilization, the more uneasy I felt. Maybe it was the long, empty roads or the way the trees seemed to swallow the light. I shook it off. I was just tired. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was setting. It was smaller than I imagined. Just a single-story building with a wraparound porch and a woodpile stacked against one side. The forest pressed close on all sides. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wood-burning stove, a sagging couch, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with an old, creaky bed. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a stash of candles. I found a note on the table from Mark's cousin, saying there was a well outside for water and an outhouse a short walk away. It ended with, "Be careful at night. Things get wild out here." I laughed it off. He probably meant animals, maybe coyotes or bears. I made a mental note to be cautious and locked up for the night. The first night was fine. I slept harder than I had in months. The silence was almost unnatural. No sirens, no honking cars, just the distant sound of the wind through the trees. When I woke up, I felt better than I had in a long time. I spent the day exploring the area, chopping some wood, and reading by the fire. That night, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Something moving just beyond the trees. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't small either. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The forest was still, too still. I shined the light around but saw nothing. No animals, no movement. Just the trees standing there, quiet and watching. After a while, I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The next morning, I found footprints near the well. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the well and then back into the woods. They weren't animal tracks, too big, too deliberate. I crouched down, trying to make sense of them. They looked human, but something was off. The stride was strange, like whoever made them had been dragging one foot slightly. I told myself it was a hunter or a hiker who got lost. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Who hikes this deep into the woods barefoot? I spent the day on edge, checking the windows, listening for sounds. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept the hatchet close. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some noise outside. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. Could have been the wind, but I didn't believe that. Then, just before dawn, something scraped against the cabin wall. Not an animal, not the wind. It was deliberate, slow, testing. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so hard my hands ached. The sound moved from one wall to the next, circling the cabin. My stomach clenched. I wanted to turn on the flashlight, but I was afraid whoever or whatever was out there would see it as an invitation. Eventually, the noise stopped. The sun rose. The feeling of relief that washed over me was brief, because when I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw it. The footprints were back. Only this time, they didn't stop at the well. They led right up to the porch, right up to the door. I packed my things in minutes. I didn't care if it was some lunatic messing with me or something worse. I wasn't staying to find out. I threw everything into the truck and peeled out of there, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station hours away. When I finally got cell service, I called Mark and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Yeah, my cousin doesn't have a cabin. I don't know whose cabin I was in. I don't know who or what was outside that night, and I don't ever want to find out." I never wanted to spend the weekend in that cabin. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, the constant noise of the city, and the stress that had been hanging over me like a storm cloud for months. My buddy Josh had been talking about this place for years, saying how peaceful it was, how isolated, how it would be good for me. I wasn't sure if I needed peace, but I agreed to go. Maybe it would help. Maybe I'd come back feeling different. Josh had to back out last minute. Work emergency, something about an important client, and just like that, I was heading up into the woods alone. It didn't bother me at first. The idea of some time to myself sounded almost nice. I had a cooler full of food, a couple of beers, a bag of firewood in the back seat. The drive up was quiet, just the hum of my tires on the old road and the occasional chirp from my GPS telling me to take another turn deeper into nowhere. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Small, old, but sturdy. It sat in a clearing, just far enough back from the tree line to get some sunlight in the late afternoon. There was a tiny porch with a couple of chairs, a stack of firewood, and a metal chimney sticking up from the roof. The inside smelled like cedar and dust, like no one had been there in a long time. It was just one big room. A bed in the corner, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with a propane burner, and a bathroom with a door that didn't quite close all the way. There was no electricity, just a couple of lanterns hanging from hooks on the wall. I set my bags down, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch, listening to the forest settle around me. The first night was fine, quiet. I built a fire outside, cooked a can of chili on the burner, and sat there in the dark, staring at the flames. The stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. There were no cars, no voices, nothing but the wind moving through the trees. I went to bed early, slept hard. The next day, I decided to explore. There was a small trail behind the cabin, barely visible, but it had been used enough that I could see where the ground was packed down. I followed it for a while, deeper into the woods, past fallen logs and old tree stumps covered in moss. The silence was thick. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in the city, where there's always something humming in the background. This was the real thing. No birds, no rustling, just my own footsteps and my breathing. I don't know how long I walked before I noticed it. A feeling, first, like I wasn't alone, like something was just out of sight, standing behind a tree or crouched in the undergrowth. I stopped, listened. Nothing. But that feeling wouldn't go away. I turned back, retraced my steps, made it back to the cabin faster than I expected. I told myself I was being stupid. The woods were playing tricks on me. I made lunch, sat by the fire again, tried to shake it off. It didn't work. That night, I heard something outside. It was late after midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. Just a single sound, like something moving just outside the cabin. A step, a foot pressing down on dry leaves. Then nothing. I sat up, holding my breath. My brain scrambled for an explanation. A deer, maybe, a raccoon, something small, but my gut was telling me no. This had been slow, deliberate, not an animal running through the woods, but something standing still, waiting, listening. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and stepped to the door as quietly as I could. I didn't want to go outside. Every part of me was screaming to stay in, to lock the door, but I needed to know. I turned the handle slowly, cracked the door open just enough to shine the flashlight out onto the porch. Nothing, just the empty clearing, the fire pit, the trees beyond. I waited, listening, but there was only the wind. I locked the door, went back to bed, told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I found footprints. Not boot prints, not hiking shoes. Bare feet pressed into the dirt just past the fire pit. They were too big for a child, too small for a man. But the strangest part was how deep they were. Like whatever had left them had been standing there for a long time, pressing down into the earth. I felt something rise in my throat, something cold and heavy. I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I packed up my things, threw everything into the truck, and started the engine. I should have left. I should have just driven out of there. But I didn't. Something kept me there. Some stupid sense of curiosity, some need to understand. I told myself I'd stay one more night, that I was imagining things, that I'd wake up in the morning and find everything fine. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart hammering, waiting for something to happen. And then, just past 2 a.m, I heard it again. A step, then another, this time closer, right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. Couldn't. Something pressed against the door. I heard the wood creak, felt the pressure, like someone was leaning against it from the other side. My body locked up. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I waited until sunrise to move. When I finally opened the door, the footprints were back. Right on the porch this time, inches from where I had been sleeping. I didn't pack neatly. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just grabbed my things, got in the truck, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until the trees were behind me, until I saw other cars, other people. I never told Josh, never told anyone. I don't know what I would even say, but I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human either, and it was waiting for me to open that door. I never should have agreed to that trip. It was a last-minute decision, one I made just to get away from everything. Work stress, city noise, the constant pull of my phone. My buddy Jason had sent me the details. A remote cabin deep in the woods. No cell service, no distractions. Just peace and quiet. "You'll love it," he had said. "It's good for the soul." I packed light. A bag with a few changes of clothes, a flashlight, some basic food supplies, and a book I had been meaning to read for years but never got around to. The drive out was long, winding through endless stretches of trees, the kind of place where the radio gives out and all you hear is the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, more like a dirt path carved out of the forest. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, wooden, one-story, with a wraparound porch and a single rocking chair out front. A small clearing surrounded it, but beyond that, the forest pressed in tight. The trees loomed tall, their branches blocking most of the sunlight, making everything feel dim even in the middle of the day. Inside, it was just as rustic as I expected. A single bed with a scratchy-looking blanket, a fireplace that smelled like old ash, and a kitchen with only the bare essentials. Canned food, a dented kettle, and a stove that looked like it belonged in a museum. There was a generator outside, but Jason had warned me it only had enough fuel for a couple of days if I used it sparingly. No running water, just a pump out back. I settled in, unpacked my bag, and decided to take a walk before it got dark. The forest was dense, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. It should have been peaceful, but something about the place put me on edge. I chalked it up to being alone. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Back home, even in the dead of night, there were sirens, people shouting, the distant hum of traffic. Here, the silence was absolute, and it made me feel exposed, like I was being watched. That first night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something moving outside. Not just the wind through the trees, but something heavier. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Morning came and I shook off the feeling. I spent the day chopping wood, hiking a little, reading. I tried to relax, but that nagging unease never really left me. As the sun set, I made a fire in the old stone fireplace and sat in the dim glow, listening. Then I heard it. Not outside this time, inside. A faint creak, like a footstep on old wood. My stomach dropped. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the small cabin. The door was still locked. The windows, too. I told myself it was just the house settling. But then it happened again. Louder, closer. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it around the room. Nothing. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. I checked every corner, under the bed, even inside the tiny closet. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I barely slept that night, every sound keeping me on edge. By the time the sun came up, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if Jason gave me crap for cutting the trip short. Something felt wrong about this place. I packed up my bag, threw it over my shoulder, and stepped outside, only to stop cold. There were footprints in the dirt. Not mine, not an animal's. Human. They led from the tree-line to the porch. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The prints were deep, fresh. Someone had been here, watching. I didn't waste any more time. I tossed my bag into the truck, started the engine, and gunned it down the dirt road. The trees blurred past as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a proper road, with other cars and streetlights and the distant sound of life. Jason laughed when I told him, "Man, you freaked yourself out. Probably just a hunter passing through." Maybe he was right. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. But I don't think so. I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. I never wanted to stay at that cabin. I should have trusted my gut. The second I pulled up the long, winding dirt road, something about it felt off. It wasn't haunted, not in any supernatural way. No ghostly figures in the windows, no eerie whispers in the trees. It was just wrong. The kind of wrong you can't put into words, but you feel it deep in your bones. The air was still, too still. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, the trees packed tightly together, their dark forms twisting against the dimming sky. I had rented the place for a week, needing the quiet, needing the space. Work had drained me. City life had worn me down, and I just wanted to be alone for a while. The cabin was cheap, suspiciously cheap for a fully furnished place with running water and electricity. But I wasn't one to question a good deal. I figured it was because it was so isolated. Miles away from the nearest town, no neighbors, just me in the woods. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner, unpacked a few things, and sat on the small porch watching the sun go down. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. I told myself it was peaceful, that I was just used to the constant hum of the city. But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt abandoned, like the world around me had stopped moving. I barely slept. The bed was fine, a little stiff, but it was the quiet that kept me awake. I didn't realize how much I relied on the distant sound of traffic, the muffled conversations through thin apartment walls, the hum of a refrigerator. Here, there was nothing. It was like being buried alive in a place where time had stopped. Every creak of the wooden cabin felt deafening. The second day, I tried to shake the feeling. I went for a walk through the woods, following an old, overgrown path that wound behind the cabin. The trees pressed in from all sides, their branches hanging low like skeletal arms reaching for me. I walked for maybe an hour before I found something that made my stomach turn. It was a campsite, or at least it had been. The tent was shredded, its bright blue fabric torn into ribbons that fluttered in the light breeze. The fire pit was filled with old, charred logs, the ashes long cold. There were clothes, scattered and half buried in the dirt, damp and rotting. A single boot sat upright near the remains of the tent, its laces frayed. No people, no sign of anyone, just the remains of a camp that had been abandoned in a hurry. I stood there, feeling my skin crawl. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, but something about it made my heart pound. Maybe it was the way the forest had already started reclaiming it, weeds curling around the fabric, roots pushing up through the disturbed soil. I turned back, fast. My mind spun with explanations. Maybe a bear had torn through it, maybe some hikers had left in a panic, maybe they'd just forgotten their things. But I knew better. I knew that wasn't it. That night, I locked the doors. I checked the windows twice. The unease had settled into my bones now, and no amount of logic could shake it. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard something outside. Not an animal. Something heavier. Something deliberate. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. But that was the problem. No footsteps moving away, no rustling in the trees. Just silence. And that was worse than hearing something, because it meant whatever was out there was still there, waiting. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, my skin prickled. The air felt thick, charged, like the moments before a storm. I decided to pack. I'd wasted enough money, and my peace of mind wasn't worth the cost of staying. I shoved my things back into my bag, moving fast, heart pounding. Then I saw it, a single muddy footprint, inside, just by the front door. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. Maybe I had tracked it in myself. Maybe it was old, something I hadn't noticed before. But I knew that wasn't true. I had been so careful, keeping the cabin clean, making sure I wasn't dragging in dirt. And the worst part? It wasn't my footprint. I didn't own boots that big. The air in the cabin felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned slowly, scanning the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just that single, solitary footprint. I grabbed my bag and moved to the door, heart hammering. I didn't care about the rest of my stuff. I just needed to get out. My hand was on the doorknob when I noticed something else. The lock. It was still locked. From the inside. That meant whoever left that footprint had been inside while I was sleeping. I didn't think. I just ran. I tore out of that cabin, down the dirt path, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. My car was in sight, but the second I got close, I knew I had made a mistake. The tires, slashed, deep gashes, the rubber shredded beyond repair. I stood there, gasping, the realization sinking in. I was trapped, miles from town, no cell service, no way out, and someone was out there watching, waiting. I forced myself to think. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I couldn't stay out in the open. The woods? No, too easy to get lost. Too easy for someone to hide. The only option was the road. It would be a long walk, but if I kept moving, if I didn't stop, I could make it. I walked, fast at first, then slower as exhaustion set in. The sun dipped below the trees, shadows stretching long across the road. Every so often, I heard something behind me. A rustle, a crunch, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. They were toying with me, letting me know they were there. I kept going, one foot in front of the other. I didn't stop, not when my legs ached, not when my lungs burned. I walked through the night, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the sky, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms, screaming. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, slowed, rolled down his window. "You okay?" I could barely speak. I just nodded, gasping for air. He drove me to town. I never went back for my car, never went back for my things. The owner of the cabin never answered my calls. It was like the place had swallowed itself whole, erasing any evidence I had ever been there. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this: I wasn't the first person to stay at that cabin, and I sure as hell wasn't supposed to leave. I had no reason to be afraid when I first arrived at the cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet week, just me and the stillness of the woods. I needed the break. Work had been exhausting, and I had barely slept in weeks. The idea of being alone in a cabin, no noise, no people, just the wind through the trees, seemed perfect. I had found the place online, a private rental deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was cheap, which should have been a red flag, but I wasn't looking for luxury, just solitude. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, a little rough around the edges but cozy. The owner promised it was stocked with everything I'd need: firewood, basic supplies, even a small generator in case the power cut out. I booked it without a second thought. The drive out was uneventful. The road twisted through dense forest, sunlight flickering between the branches. I saw a few deer in the distance, their heads lifting as my car approached before they bounded back into the trees. It was peaceful. The last stretch of road turned to dirt, and I had to slow down. The cabin sat back from the path, partially hidden by the trees. It looked just like the pictures: weathered wood, a slanted roof, a small front porch with a single rocking chair. It had a charm to it, in a way, the kind of place someone might use for hunting or just getting away from the world. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. I grabbed my bag and walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking under my weight. The key was under the mat, just like the owner had said in the email. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was small but clean. A single room with a fireplace against one wall, a worn-out couch, and a tiny kitchen in the corner. A door to the right led to a bedroom with an old bed, its mattress slightly sagging in the middle. The bathroom was even smaller, just a toilet and a shower stall with a curtain that looked like it had been there for decades. It was fine. Not fancy, but fine. I dropped my bag on the bed and went to check the kitchen. The cupboards held a few cans of soup, some boxes of crackers, a couple bottles of water. Enough to last a few days. There was firewood stacked by the fireplace, just like the owner promised. I felt good about it. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, listened to the crackling of the wood as I ate a can of soup straight from the pot. No cell service out here, but I had expected that. I had brought a few books with me, figuring I'd pass the time reading. I sat by the fire until my eyes grew heavy, then crawled into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. First, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the floor. I lay still, listening, but heard nothing. Then I noticed the door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I remembered turning the key, checking it twice, but now it was open just a crack, the dark forest visible through the gap. My stomach clenched. I sat up slowly, straining to hear anything beyond the walls of the cabin. Nothing. No footsteps. No rustling. Just silence. I slipped out of bed, moving carefully to the door. My heart was pounding. I reached out and pushed it shut, turning the lock again, testing the handle to make sure it was secure. Then I checked the windows. They were all locked. No sign that anyone had tried to get in. The only way in or out was the front door. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. I told myself that as I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket tighter around me. I lay awake for a long time, listening, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next day, I convinced myself it had been nothing, just my own forgetfulness. I spent the day exploring the woods, following narrow trails that wound between towering trees. The forest was dense, quiet, peaceful, but something about it felt off, like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and turn, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anything, just trees and shadows. That night, I locked the door. I checked it 3 times before going to bed. I woke up again at 2 a.m. The door was open, a little wider this time. The air outside was black, the trees barely visible in the darkness. I stared at the gap, my breath caught in my throat. Someone had been inside. I got up, my hands shaking as I pushed the door shut again, locking it with more force than necessary. Then I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and jammed it under the doorknob. If someone tried to come in again, they'd have to shove the whole thing out of the way. I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I was too afraid to turn off the lantern by my bed. I just lay there, staring at the door, waiting. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my bag, tossing everything inside without bothering to fold it. My hands were unsteady as I grabbed my car keys from the counter. I yanked open the door, stepping onto the porch, and froze. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh, leading from the trees to my cabin and back again. Not animal tracks, not boots, bare feet. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been inside last night had walked barefoot through the woods. I didn't waste another second. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. I climbed in, locked the doors, started the engine. Gravel kicked up behind me as I sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until I reached a gas station on the edge of town. I sat in my car for a long time trying to slow my breathing. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who was out there watching me, who came inside while I slept. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods. I never wanted to stay in the cabin overnight. I was only supposed to check on it, make sure everything was fine, and then head back down before dark. But things don't always go the way we plan, do they? It was my uncle's cabin, deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. He had owned it for years, using it as a hunting lodge during the fall and a getaway spot in the summer. He loved that place, but since his stroke, he couldn't take care of it anymore. So he asked me to check on it. Just a quick visit, he had said. Make sure the roof hadn't caved in, the pipes hadn't burst, and no squatters had taken up residence. I didn't mind helping out. It was a Saturday, and I had nothing better to do. The drive up was peaceful, the trees thick on either side of the dirt road, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The leaves were just starting to turn, reds and oranges bleeding through the green. I had a full tank of gas, a backpack with some snacks and a flashlight, and my phone was fully charged. Everything seemed fine. The road ended in a clearing where the cabin sat. It was an old log structure, weathered but sturdy, built by my uncle's own hands. The front porch sagged a little, and the windows were coated in a thin layer of dust. It looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and stepped out. The silence was thick. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. No distant hum of traffic, no other people. Just me and the woods. The key was under the loose board on the porch, just like my uncle had said. It took a little effort to turn in the lock, but the door creaked open. The inside smelled of wood, dust, and something stale, like old fabric that had been sitting too long. The furniture was all covered in sheets, and the fireplace was cold. I walked through each room, checking for leaks or damage. Everything seemed fine. A little dusty, but fine. I should have left then. Locked up, gotten back in my truck, and driven home. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the light was fading, or the sudden awareness of how alone I was. Maybe it was just a gut feeling. Either way, I hesitated, and that hesitation changed everything. I decided to stay the night. It was a dumb choice, I know that now, but at the time it felt logical. Driving back in the dark on those winding roads didn't seem smart, and I had everything I needed to camp out. Food, water, a sleeping bag in the truck. It would just be one night. In the morning, I'd be gone. I brought in my sleeping bag, set it up in the main room near the fireplace, and found some old firewood stacked neatly outside. I started a fire, warmed up some canned soup I'd brought, and settled in for the night. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. The first thing that put me on edge was the feeling. That heavy, pressing stillness, like something was watching me. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something staring back. But there was nothing, just darkness and trees. Then I heard it, a sound outside, faint at first, then louder. Footsteps, not the scampering of animals or the shifting of trees. Human footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I froze, staring at the front door. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But who would be out here this late in the middle of nowhere? The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I barely breathed. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. Slow at first, then fading into the woods. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I forced myself to stand, inching toward the window. I pressed my face to the cold glass, peering into the darkness. Nothing. I should have packed up and left right then. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an animal, maybe even my own imagination playing tricks on me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat back down by the fire. I even managed to drift off for a while. I woke up to a sound, a soft, scraping noise, like metal against wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I sat up, every nerve on edge. The fire had died down, casting the room in shadows. The scraping sound came again, longer this time, more deliberate. My stomach twisted. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the back door. The handle rattled just once, then went still. My mouth was dry. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it at the window beside the door. And I saw it, a figure just beyond the glass, dressed in dark clothing, face obscured, standing completely still, watching. My blood turned to ice. I backed away, heart slamming against my ribs. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. I reached for my phone, hands shaking. No signal. Of course. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, I was on my own. I had to make a decision. Stay inside and hope they went away, or make a run for the truck. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved, turned, disappearing into the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and bolted. The moment I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a wall. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud. I sprinted to the truck, fumbled with the keys, and yanked the door open. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, running this time, fast. I threw myself into the truck, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. My headlights flooded the clearing. For a split second, I saw movement in the trees, a glimpse of dark clothing, a figure darting between the trunks. Then I hit the gas, speeding down the dirt road so fast the truck bounced and skidded. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I drove straight home, didn't stop, didn't look back. The next morning, I called my uncle. I told him everything. He listened quietly, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. "That's why I stopped going." I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say. Just told me to leave it alone, let the cabin rot. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I don't know if writing this down will help, but I need to get it out of my head. Maybe if I put everything into words, I can stop thinking about it. Maybe it will make sense, or maybe it never will. Either way, I have to try. It started with a simple plan: rent a cabin, take a break from work, and spend some time in nature. I wanted solitude, peace, a chance to reset. I'd found the place online, a small cabin way out in the woods, miles from any town. The pictures showed a cozy little place, rustic but well kept, with a wood-burning stove, a small porch, and a lake nearby. Perfect. The drive out took longer than expected. The roads got worse the deeper I went. Pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, then something that barely passed for a road at all. My car struggled over deep ruts and loose rocks. No cell signal, no signs, just trees pressing in from all sides. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place looked like the pictures, a little weathered but solid. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the owner had said. I let myself in. It smelled like old wood and dust, a hint of something musty. The inside was simple: one main room with a small kitchen area, a couch, a table, and a fireplace. A single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just what I wanted. I unpacked, made some coffee, and sat on the porch. The silence was thick. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Peace. That first night, I slept hard. Too hard. The kind of sleep that feels like sinking into something heavy. When I woke up, it was still dark. I lay there, disoriented, listening. Something had woken me. A sound outside. A low, steady crunching, like footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, listened harder. Nothing. Just my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Probably an animal. Maybe a deer. I forced myself to relax, but sleep wouldn't come back. Eventually, I got up and checked the lock on the door. Still bolted. I peered out the window, but the darkness was thick, absolute. I turned away, feeling stupid. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Not boot prints, not bare feet, just disturbances in the loose earth. Scuffed patches where something had moved. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind shifting leaves, just my imagination. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. That night, it happened again. Woke up, heart pounding. Same sound. Slow, steady footsteps. Closer this time. I stayed still, barely breathing. It stopped right outside the cabin. Silence stretched long and thin. My skin prickled. Then the sound changed. Faint scraping noise, like nails dragging over wood. My stomach twisted. I reached for my phone, knowing before I looked, no signal. I checked the time. 3:12 a.m. Too late to be awake. Too early for morning. I waited. The scraping stopped. Nothing but silence. I stayed in bed until the first light seeped through the curtains. When I finally got the courage to go outside, there were marks on the porch. Faint but there. Long, uneven lines etched into the wood. I spent the day trying to convince myself to stay. I paid for the full week. I told myself it was just my nerves. I was in an unfamiliar place, alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I almost believed it, until the third night. This time, I didn't wake up to footsteps. I woke up because I couldn't breathe. It felt like something heavy was pressing down on my chest. squeezing the air from my lungs. I gasped, fought, but my body wouldn't move. My vision blurred, my head swam. My own heartbeat pounded in my ears, frantic and wild. I was drowning in nothing. Then it stopped. Just like that, the weight lifted, air rushed back into my lungs. I shot up, coughing, sucking in greedy breaths. I turned on every light in the cabin. My hands shook as I splashed water on my face. I didn't go back to sleep. In the morning, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed fast, throwing everything into my bag without caring if it fit. The uneasy feeling hadn't left me. If anything, it had gotten worse, like something was watching, waiting. I stepped outside and stopped cold. The ground was covered in tracks. Not footprints, not paw prints, just disturbances in the dirt, circling the cabin, overlapping, endless. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my keys and bolted to my car. It wouldn't start. I tried again and again. The engine clicked but didn't catch. Panic clawed at my throat. I popped the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything looked fine. No reason it shouldn't start. I slammed it shut and turned in a slow circle. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness, heavy and unnatural. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The road was rough, winding, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked for miles, legs aching, breath ragged. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. Slow. Steady. I forced myself to keep going, not to run. Running would make it worse. I didn't know how, but I knew. The sun was dipping low when I saw a truck in the distance. An old man standing beside it, filling a gas can. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing. "You all right?" I nodded too fast. "My car broke down." He frowned. "Where you coming from?" I pointed back toward the woods. His face changed. Just a flicker, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Come on," he said, opening the truck door. "I'll take you to town." I didn't ask questions. I climbed in, slammed the door, and didn't look back. I never went back for my car. Never tried to find out what had happened. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some things aren't meant to be understood. I don't know what was out there, but I know it was real, and I know it was waiting. I never liked the woods. I never understood people who said they felt at peace out there. To me, it was just miles of things I couldn't see, noises I couldn't place, and the kind of silence that made your ears ring. But my brother, Kyle, loved it. He always had. So when he invited me out to his new place, a cabin way out past the edge of cell service, past any road I recognized, I knew I would say yes, even though I didn't want to. He'd moved out there 6 months ago, saying he was tired of the city, tired of people, said he just wanted space. The drive was long. After I turned off the highway, the roads got narrow, winding through dense trees that pressed in on both sides. The last stretch was just dirt, uneven and full of ruts deep enough that I thought my car might get stuck. It was almost dark by the time I got there, my headlights catching the outline of the cabin just before I reached it. Kyle's truck was parked outside, but the place looked empty. No lights on, no movement. I got out, stretched my legs, and called his name. No answer. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I should have left then. I should have trusted that crawling feeling in my stomach, the one I always get when something isn't right. But I didn't. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was colder than it should have been, considering how hot the day had been. A weird, stale smell hung in the air, something sharp underneath it, like old sweat or wet wood. The living room was a mess. Papers scattered on the coffee table, a plate with something dried and crusted on it sitting on the arm of the couch. A single lamp was on, casting just enough light to make the rest of the place feel darker. I called Kyle's name again. Nothing. I checked the kitchen. The fridge was half open, humming softly, its light spilling out onto the floor. Inside, there were a few things: beer, a half-empty carton of eggs, something wrapped in foil, but not enough for someone living out here full-time. I found his bedroom door slightly open. The bed was unmade, the blankets twisted up like someone had left in a hurry. His boots were on the floor next to it. One was tipped over. I stood there for a long time just listening. That's when I heard it. A rustling outside, not close, but not far either. Not the wind, not an animal, something else. I turned off the lamp, my heart slamming in my chest. Moved to the window, careful not to let my shadow fall across it. I couldn't see anything at first, just the trees, their branches shifting slightly. Then I saw movement, low to the ground, far enough away that I couldn't make out what it was. But it was definitely a person. I backed away from the window, my breath caught in my throat. I had no weapon, no way to call for help. My car keys were still on the coffee table. I listened. The woods had gone silent. Then footsteps, slow, careful, moving around the side of the cabin. I grabbed the keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I didn't bother turning on any lights. I crept to the door, my socked feet making no sound on the wooden floor. My car was only 20 feet away. If I ran, if I was fast, I could make it. Then something brushed the window behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. A shadow just outside the glass. Not pressed against it, but close enough that I could see the outline of a head, shoulders. I couldn't see the face. Didn't want to. I moved fast, wrenching the door open and sprinting to the car. My breath came in short gasps as I yanked the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. The porch light flicked on. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. The figure took a step forward. I turned the key again, harder this time, whispering a prayer through clenched teeth. The car roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt. My headlights caught the figure for a split second, just long enough for me to see that it wasn't Kyle. I sped down the dirt road, heart pounding, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I never went back, never found out what happened to Kyle. The cops searched, but there was no sign of him, no sign of struggle, just an empty cabin, his truck still parked outside. They said he probably wandered off, got lost in the woods. But I don't think so. I think someone was waiting for him, and when he didn't come back, they waited for me. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of work. So when I got the chance to rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains for a week, I didn't hesitate. It was an old place, small but sturdy, with a wood-burning stove, a hand-pumped well out back, and an outhouse instead of a bathroom. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the only way to get there was a winding dirt road that seemed barely wide enough for my truck. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the trails, fishing in a nearby creek, and reading on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Felt good to be disconnected. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush. I slept better than I had in years, with the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes when you're truly at ease. That changed on the fourth night. I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing at the windows as if someone was looking inside. I had locked the door before bed, and the windows had old wooden latches, but suddenly that didn't feel like enough. My heart pounded as I lay still, waiting. After a few minutes, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt, but I found something near the steps. Boot prints. Not fresh enough to be from that night, but recent. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin belonged to an older couple who only rented it out a few times a year, and they had assured me that no one else would be nearby. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just a hiker who had gotten lost and stumbled upon the place. Still, I kept my hunting knife closer that night. The next few nights were worse. Every night, the footsteps came back. They never tried the door, never knocked, never spoke. just paced around the cabin, stopping at the windows. I started keeping the lantern on, hoping the light would scare them off. Didn't. On the sixth night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't gonna just lie there and listen. When the footsteps returned, I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and threw open the door. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. The night was still, the trees barely swaying in the light breeze. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. Not a person, not an animal. A shape, a figure just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stood still, watching. My pulse thundered in my ears. I took a step forward, and it moved. Just a little, but enough to tell me it wasn't some tree stump or trick of the light. I shouted, "Who's there?" but got no answer. Then it turned and walked into the woods. Not running, not startled, just walking. I stayed on the porch, watching until the darkness swallowed it. I barely slept that night, and at first light, I packed my things. The week wasn't over, but I didn't care. I was done. I threw my gear into my truck, started the engine, and backed out of the clearing. As I reached the edge of the woods, I looked in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't go back. I drove straight to the nearest town, booked a motel for the night, and told myself I'd go back in the morning to return the cabin key to the owners. But when I called them, they were confused. They said the cabin had been empty for years, that they hadn't rented it out to anyone since their grandfather passed away. I still don't know who or what was in that cabin with me, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I rented the cabin for a week. I just needed time away from everything, work, my phone, people. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom place deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest town. The ad said it was quiet and private, perfect for someone looking to unwind. That's all I wanted. Peace. The drive there was simple. A 2-lane road most of the way, then a dirt path that cut through the trees. I didn't see another car the whole time. It was early evening when I pulled up. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked even smaller in person. Just a single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a fire pit out front. The key was under a loose rock by the door, just like the owner had said. Inside, it was basic. A tiny kitchen, a couch, a fireplace, and a bedroom with a single bed. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio sitting on the counter. That was fine by me. I unpacked my bag, made a quick dinner, and sat on the porch as the last bit of light faded. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. By the time I went to bed, the world outside was pitch black. I fell asleep easily, listening to the wind. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, just drifted awake, like something had pulled me out of sleep. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels thick, like a weight pressing down. I turned onto my side, facing the window. It was dark, but I could make out the trees swaying in the wind. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound outside, like footsteps moving through the leaves. I held my breath, listening. The wind had stopped. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps just beyond the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, a raccoon. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone walking. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside. Nothing, just shadows. I scanned the yard, the fire pit, the edge of the woods. No movement, no sound. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing myself to relax. I listened for a while, but the noise didn't come back. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so I couldn't see any footprints. It was probably just my imagination. I made breakfast, drank some coffee, and spent the day hiking a few trails nearby. By the time I got back, I had almost forgotten about the sound. That night, I locked the door and closed the curtains. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night, This time, the sound was different. Not footsteps, something softer like breathing, just outside the bedroom window. My body went rigid. The breathing was slow and deep. Not mine, not an animal, human. I sat up, heart hammering. The curtains were shut, but I felt exposed, like whoever was outside could see me. I reached for the flashlight again, but stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. I listened. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, then slowly faded. I waited a long time before I dared to move. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the yard again. Still no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back home. But it felt ridiculous to run over some weird noises. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe I wasn't used to the silence out here. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept the flashlight in my hand as I lay in bed. I didn't wake up to footsteps or breathing. I woke up to knocking. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the front door. I shot up, every nerve in my body on fire. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced. If it was a person, why would they be knocking at this hour? And why wouldn't they say something? No, hello. No, I need help. Just knocking. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting, listening. Nothing. After a long time, I got out of bed and moved as quietly as I could to the front room. The cabin had no peephole, no side windows to check who was outside. Just the front door. I stood there, heart pounding, listening. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door. There was nothing outside. Just the empty porch, the fire pit, the trees. The night was still, no wind, no movement. But there was something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A single, deep footprint in the dirt in front of the door. Too big for my foot. There. I slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the couch against it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there with my flashlight, jumping at every sound. By the time the sun came up, I had already packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for a week. I was leaving. I grabbed my bag, moved the couch, and yanked the door open. A pile of rocks sat on the porch. Not random, stacked, deliberate. 5 stones, one on top of the other, right in front of the door. I don't remember running to my car, but suddenly I was in the driver's seat, tearing down the dirt road, watching the cabin disappear in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were watching me, and they were close, closer than I ever want a stranger to be again. I rented the cabin for a week. I just needed time away from everything, work, my phone, people. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 1-bedroom place deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest town. The ad said it was quiet and private, perfect for someone looking to unwind. That's all I wanted. Peace. The drive there was simple. A 2-lane road most of the way, then a dirt path that cut through the trees. I didn't see another car the whole time. It was early evening when I pulled up. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked even smaller in person. Just a single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a fire pit out front. The key was under a loose rock by the door, just like the owner had said. Inside, it was basic. A tiny kitchen, a couch, a fireplace, and a bedroom with a single bed. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio sitting on the counter. That was fine by me. I unpacked my bag, made a quick dinner, and sat on the porch as the last bit of light faded. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. By the time I went to bed, the world outside was pitch black. I fell asleep easily, listening to the wind. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, just drifted awake, like something had pulled me out of sleep. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels thick, like a weight pressing down. I turned onto my side, facing the window. It was dark, but I could make out the trees swaying in the wind. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound outside, like footsteps moving through the leaves. I held my breath, listening. The wind had stopped. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps just beyond the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, a raccoon. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone walking. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside. Nothing, just shadows. I scanned the yard, the fire pit, the edge of the woods. No movement, no sound. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing myself to relax. I listened for a while, but the noise didn't come back. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so I couldn't see any footprints. It was probably just my imagination. I made breakfast, drank some coffee, and spent the day hiking a few trails nearby. By the time I got back, I had almost forgotten about the sound. That night, I locked the door and closed the curtains. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was different. Not footsteps, something softer like breathing, just outside the bedroom window. My body went rigid. The breathing was slow and deep. Not mine, not an animal, human. I sat up, heart hammering. The curtains were shut, but I felt exposed, like whoever was outside could see me. I reached for the flashlight again, but stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. I listened. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, then slowly faded. I waited a long time before I dared to move. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the yard again. Still no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back home. But it felt ridiculous to run over some weird noises. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe I wasn't used to the silence out here. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept the flashlight in my hand as I lay in bed. I didn't wake up to footsteps or breathing. I woke up to knocking. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the front door. I shot up, every nerve in my body on fire. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced. If it was a person, why would they be knocking at this hour? And why wouldn't they say something? No, hello. No, I need help. Just knocking. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting, listening. Nothing. After a long time, I got out of bed and moved as quietly as I could to the front room. The cabin had no peephole, no side windows to check who was outside. Just the front door. I stood there, heart pounding, listening. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door. There was nothing outside. Just the empty porch, the fire pit, the trees. The night was still, no wind, no movement. But there was something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A single, deep footprint in the dirt in front of the door. Too big for my foot. There. I slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the couch against it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there with my flashlight, jumping at every sound. By the time the sun came up, I had already packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for a week. I was leaving. I grabbed my bag, moved the couch, and yanked the door open. A pile of rocks sat on the porch. Not random, stacked, deliberate. 5 stones, one on top of the other, right in front of the door. I don't remember running to my car, but suddenly I was in the driver's seat, tearing down the dirt road, watching the cabin disappear in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were watching me, and they were close, closer than I ever want a stranger to be again. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, people, the noise of daily life. I wanted solitude, time to think, to clear my head. I found the listing online. An old but well-kept place, nothing fancy. Just a cabin, a lake, and miles of trees in every direction. The owner left the keys in a lockbox by the front door, said they wouldn't be around, but I could call if I needed anything. I got there late in the afternoon. The drive was long, mostly empty roads, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. The last stretch was a dirt path, rough and full of potholes, the kind that made me wonder if my car would make it back out. The cabin itself was small, dark wood, a porch with an old rocking chair. Inside was simple: one main room with a couch, a fireplace, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom off to the side. I unloaded my things, set my phone to charge, and sat on the porch for a while, just listening. The woods were quiet. No distant traffic, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional creak from the cabin settling. Felt good at first, the kind of quiet I had been looking for. But the longer I sat there, the heavier it felt, like the silence was too deep, too thick. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace, had a couple of beers, and read a book. The wind picked up outside, branches scratching against the roof. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I noticed something. My car door was open. I was sure I had shut it. I walked outside, my flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of animals. Just my car with the door wide open. I shut it, locked it this time, and went back inside, telling myself I must have left it open. The next day, I hiked around the lake, explored a bit. The woods were dense, thick with old trees, moss-covered rocks. I didn't see another soul, no boats on the lake, no other cabins nearby. It was peaceful, but that feeling from the night before lingered, like something was just slightly off, like I was being watched. I shook it off, told myself it was just my imagination. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something outside, not the wind, something moving, slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. Then the rocking chair creaked. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin in near darkness. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the window. The chair was still, empty. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anything had been there. But my car door was open again. This time, I knew I had locked it. I checked inside, nothing missing. But there were scratches on the outside, near the handle, like someone had tried to pry it open. I packed my things, decided to leave a day early. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine just clicked. It wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I wasn't staying another night. I grabbed my phone. No signal. I had seen a small gas station about 20 miles back on the main road. If I hiked out, I could make it before dark. I packed a bag with water, a flashlight, and a jacket and set off. The hike was long, the woods too quiet. Every now and then, I stopped, listening, feeling like something was behind me. But every time I turned around, nothing was there. I reached the road just as the sun was starting to set. The gas station was further than I remembered. I walked faster. When I finally saw it, a small, rundown place with a single pump, I felt a wave of relief. The man inside was old, wearing a faded flannel and a worn-out cap. He barely looked up when I walked in. I explained my situation, asked if there was a tow service nearby. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked past me, out toward the woods. "You walked here?" he asked. I nodded. His face changed, like something heavy settled in his eyes. "You need a ride back to town?" I hesitated. "I just need a tow." He didn't answer right away, just looked out the window again. Finally, he nodded. "I'll call someone." I waited inside while he made the call. The place smelled like old coffee and dust. I looked around, newspapers stacked on a counter, a rack of snacks that had probably been there too long. After a while, he hung up. "Truck'll be here in an hour." I thanked him, bought a bottle of water, and sat near the window watching the woods. The feeling hadn't left me. That weight, like something was still out there, waiting. The tow truck finally came, an older guy driving, barely said a word. We rode in silence back to the cabin. The driver kept glancing at the woods, like he was expecting to see something. When we got back, my car started on the first try. I didn't question it. I didn't ask how. I just threw my things in the back seat and left without looking back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know this: I will never go back. I didn't want to go. The cabin belonged to my old friend Alex, who had invited me out for a weekend of getting away from it all. I hadn't seen him in years, but we used to be close. Life happened, jobs, relationships, responsibilities, but he reached out, said he had a place now, deep in the woods a few hours outside the city. He wanted company, said he needed it. I told him I'd think about it, but he called again a few days later, almost pleading. So I went. The drive was long, the last stretch a single dirt road that looked barely maintained. Trees closed in on either side, branches reaching overhead, making the late afternoon light feel dimmer than it should have been. My truck's tires crunched over loose gravel, and I kept glancing at my phone. No signal. I had downloaded an offline map, but it wasn't much help. I just followed the road and hoped for the best. Alex's cabin was at the end of the road, a small, one-story thing made of old wood. A porch wrapped around the front, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side. His truck was parked next to it, an older model, caked in dried mud. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, calling his name as I stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and something else I couldn't place. Not rot, but close. The living room was simple: couch, coffee table, old fireplace with a stack of split logs beside it. A kitchen was off to the left, and a single hallway led deeper in. I called out again. Nothing. There was an open beer on the counter, half finished, condensation still on the glass. His phone was there too, next to a pile of mail. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The woods outside were silent. No wind, no birds, no movement. Just the sound of my own breathing. I checked the back door, unlocked. Stepping outside, I saw more woods, stretching into nothingness. The fire pit out back was cold, ashes piled inside. A few feet away, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They led away from the cabin. Just one set, pressed deep into the damp earth, heading straight into the woods. I hesitated, then followed. The trees swallowed me quickly. The prints were easy to track at first, the ground still soft from recent rain. They were deep, spaced far apart. He had been walking fast, or running. After a few minutes, the woods thickened, the footprints harder to see. I kept going, scanning the ground, stepping carefully. Every now and then, I stopped to listen. Nothing, just the occasional creak of branches swaying high above. Then I found something. A torn piece of fabric, caught on a low branch. Dark, maybe blue or black. I pulled it free and kept walking. The footprints were harder to follow now, but I kept moving in the same direction. 100 feet later, I found more. A scuff mark in the dirt, a broken branch, signs of movement. Then ahead, something else. Clearing. The ground here was disturbed, like someone had struggled. Leaves kicked up, dirt scraped away. And in the middle of it, blood. Just a few small drops, dried now, dark against the earth. My stomach tightened. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, suddenly aware of how alone I was, how far I had come. My truck was miles away. No cell service, no roads, just trees. I crouched down, looking closer. The footprints didn't end here. They veered off, less defined, heading toward something in the distance. A shape half hidden behind the trees. A cabin, smaller than Alex's, older. The wood was nearly black with age, the windows covered with grime. No path leading to it, no signs of life. just sitting there, hidden deep in the woods. I should have turned back. I know that now, but I didn't. I moved closer. The cabin had a single door, slightly open. No sounds inside. No movement. I stepped up, pushed the door wider. The smell hit me first. Rotting wood, old mildew, something else underneath. Something foul. The interior was dark, but light streamed in through gaps in the walls. A small table, a chair, a bed. And in the corner, pile of something. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Clothes, torn, dirt-stained, crumpled in a heap. And on top, Alex's jacket. I turned, stomach tight, scanning the cabin. There was no sign of him, but he had been here recently. Then I saw the marks on the floor. Drag marks, leading toward the back of the cabin to a second door, slightly ajar. I moved forward, every part of me screaming to leave, to run. But I had come this far. The door opened into a second room, smaller, darker, and there, against the far wall, a hole in the floor, deep, wide enough for a man to fit through. A ladder led down into blackness. The smell was worse here, thick and wet. I listened. Nothing, just my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then, a noise, faint, from below. I stepped closer, peering down. My eyes adjusted slowly. The hole stretched deeper than I thought, maybe 10 feet down, opening into a space below. And at the bottom, movement. Someone was down there. I didn't think. I ran, out of the cabin, into the woods, sprinting back the way I came. Branches tore at my arms, my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I saw Alex's cabin again. My truck was still there. I jumped in, locked the doors, started the engine. And that's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the woods, standing between the trees, watching me. Not Alex, someone else. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, turned around, and sped down the dirt road, gravel flying. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I made it back to town before I even checked my phone. Signal returned. I called the police, told them everything. They investigated. They found Alex's cabin. They found the second cabin. They found the hole. It was empty. They searched for days. No sign of Alex. No sign of anyone. They asked me questions. I told them everything. They never found him. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know who that was in the woods. But I know one thing. I'll never go back.